hungry, stressed, traumatized, and falsely accused clients who are all victims of what I call human greed. I have, however, decided to prolong my stay and be here because the right to life is the most fundamental. We, the members of the Cameroon Conflict Research Group, are not politicians, but we are here because of the lives of people who have been affected by the crisis. We are out to speak the truth. We are out to speak the truth because fear has become the order of the day in Cameroon. We are going to shout on mountaintops because it is a noble thing to do. It is better to die in dignity for having told the truth than to live with the shame for covering up. The truth remains the truth, whether it is accepted or not. And that truth is that there is some form of slow genocide going on in the Southern Cameroons, and the international community has decided to pay a deaf ear because of their selfish ends. Today, I refuse to think globally, meaning I have refused to think of people dying in thousands of villages burned down. I've decided to put myself in the shoes of individuals rather than groups. I listened to a story from a lady in my office yesterday about a soldier who, after killing her 2-month-old son, prided himself for having killed a future amber fighter. Seeing myself in this lady was an eye-opener. Today, on behalf of the Southern Cameroons Conflict Research Group, I wish to state that we are adding our voices to those of the parents whose children have been killed, all the orphans, widows, prisoners, the homeless, those tortured, the hungry, the adopted, and those having difficulties to give the dead dignified burials. We applaud all of you here in presence, the international organizations and some governments for the efforts they have made to resolve this conflict. On behalf of the suffering people of Southern Cameroons, we say thank you. Your efforts and that of the your efforts and the US Congress resolutions, to me, is an indication that in this dark well of sameness, there are still a few stars to illuminate the horizon. The resolution is just a tool, and much is still left to be done. Our appeal, therefore, to all of you present is to fight as if it were your child or relation that has been killed, abducted, hungry, wrecked, tortured, or detained. The dead cannot cry for justice. It is the duty of the living to do so for them. It is our fervent wish that at the end of this conference, we will be able to come out with a way forward on how to get other international bodies and global international partners to engage in the fight for justice and peace in Southern Cameroons. To conclude, I would beg to borrow from Buke in quotes. They say for evil to triumph, all it takes is for good people to do nothing. But I say for good people to do nothing is worse than evil. Of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate what you've just said, and I think we can all agree in saying that it's a really severe situation that's going on, and more international spotlight we should start concentrating on that more. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Roxana Willis. So if I've asked you to unmute, so if you could unmute.
Here we go. I'm just going to share my screen. I prepared a very quick. Oh, but it says the host has disabled screen sharing.
It says possible on mine. Sorry, 1 second.
Try it one more. So I've been asked to talk about the causes of the conflict. And I'm Dr. Roxana Willis, who's a member of the research group at the University of Oxford and principal investigator. I've been asked, sorry, I'm repeating myself, I've prepared. Should I try once more, Rania? Oh yeah. Okay, right. Unfortunately, I have prepared a presentation, which I really hope to share with you today, because I feel it is important that we see and address and engage in these issues in a particular way. And so I was hoping to be able to use some visual aids. I will try and adapt without it and see how we, yeah, it's not going to work. Okay, fine. Okay, so I have only around 7 minutes, so a great deal has to be omitted anyway. Nevertheless, I hope this offers a starting point. So a striking feature of the Cameroon conflict is the lack of attention afforded by international actors. Despite the brutality of violence in which children have been prime targets, international response has been worryingly. Sorry, could I stop? Rania, would it be possible if I asked someone else to go ahead and we'll see if we can rectify this?
Yes, of course.
Just, I think it's such a shame to lose the presentation because yeah.
It says possible for all to screen share on my settings, so I'll just check it while our next speaker goes. And
lovely, thank you very much for that.
Our next speaker is Lord Bertang, so we will go to him. I've asked you to unmute, so if you could unmute and begin, I think that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, moderator, and heartfelt thanks to all those who've made this important conference possible. It didn't just happen, I know, and I think we all owe you a debt of gratitude for the work that's gone into bringing us together. You know, in my own tradition, moderator, I was brought up in the eastern region of Ghana, the Gold Coast as was. When you are introduced to a group of people who you haven't met before, and it's for the first time, you don't actually begin with your name, Paul Boateng. You don't mention your titles, your previous occupations, lawyer, cabinet minister, parliamentarian, ambassador, high commissioner. You don't mention any of that. You don't even talk, and this is unusual in an African context, you don't even say who your parents were, because one of the features, as many of you on this call will know, of African life is that you never escape your parents. Whoever you are, you're always your mother and father's son or daughter. That's the way it is. But you don't even mention any of those things. You simply answer one question. Do you know what that question is? Why are you here? Why are you here? Which, if you think about it, is the best possible way of introducing yourself. Why are you here? I'm here because the situation in the Cameroon cries out for publicity. It cries out for a response. It cries out for action. 4 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, 2.7 million of those suffering from food insecurity, nearly 1 million internally displaced people, and nearly 400,000 refugees. That cries out for an international response, a response that has not so far, with a number of honorable exceptions, and the latest resolution from the Senate in the United States is one of them, a situation that has not caused a response or an outcry on the part of the international community in the way that it should. So I think all of us, activists, lawyers, parliamentarians, legislators, academics, whoever we are, all of us need to be amplifying the situation that exists in the Cameroon, And all of us need to see ourselves and our institutions as part of the solution. And if we don't, frankly, sisters and brothers, we become part of the problem. So that's why I'm here, to join with you to see what it is that we can do in order to change the situation on the ground in the Cameroon. And to do that, we need to do a number of things. Obviously, we've got to operate at one level on meeting immediate needs. And those needs are for food. Those needs are for shelter. Those needs are of a humanitarian nature. And that's not just something for governments, that's also something for humanitarian activist organizations globally. And we need to engage in that process. But ultimately, a sustainable response, a response that's going to effectively change the conditions on the ground, requires a new focus, a new momentum around conflict resolution and peacekeeping. And that requires the engagement of international institutions and regional institutions. So it seems to me that we need to look and to ask ourselves the question, what international institutions are best placed to make a difference? And also, and importantly, where does the responsibility lie? Now, one of the reasons why I'm here is because I'm actually old enough to remember as a child the plebiscite. And I remember it not just because Ghana is, the Gold Coast is a near neighbor of the Cameroon. I remember it also because of the word plebiscite. And if you are a young person, as I was at that time, words fascinate you, don't they? I mean, that's the nature of our human condition. And I remember asking my mum and dad, Mum, what is a plebiscite? Because I didn't know what it was. And it was a word I heard a lot about. And I can tell you, the whole region was engaged with what was happening in the Cameroon. We knew that an important vote was taking place. We knew that the outcome of that vote would affect the lives of millions of people for many years to come. And indeed, that has proved to be the case. And so we shouldn't forget who was responsible for the plebiscite, who was responsible for oversight of the plebiscite. We shouldn't forget the role of the United Nations, the League of Nations before that. We shouldn't forget that the colonial powers involved, France, England, Great Britain, before that, Germany, inevitably must bear some responsibility for what occurred. And I'm not arguing that we should have some sort of post-mortem or that we should have an apportionment of blame, but we cannot escape the fact that the former colonial powers have a responsibility because essentially they were initially part of the problem. They have a responsibility now to be part of the solution. And the permanent members of the Security Council, it seems to me, but France and the UK in particular, have a specific responsibility to ensure that the UN machinery is brought to bear as part of the solution. And so I would argue that as we look forward, we need to support the work of the World Food Programme, certainly. We need to look at the engagement of the UN High Commission of Refugees and make sure all those programs are properly funded. That's an immediate humanitarian response and a need to meet those initial and immediate needs. But we also need to look at how the machinery of the United Nations, the machinery in Geneva, the Human Rights Committee, how it can operate, how it can appoint rapporteurs, how it can carry out investigations in order to address the human rights situation, and hold those responsible to account. And we also need, it seems to me, to look at how we as parliamentarians can work in order to ensure that our respective governments engage with this issue and make it a priority. And that's a particular responsibility that parliamentarians have. It's a particular responsibility that I'm happy to say, and the engagement of parliamentarians in this conference is an indication of the growing extent of interest. The bipartisan coming together of members of the US Senate is the best possible example that we in other democratic assemblies need to emulate. And that needs to drive a process that makes a difference on the ground. But I would just make this point as I draw my remarks to a conclusion before we move into other presentations and discussion. I don't believe that the situation in the Cameroon can be resolved in New York or in foreign capitals alone. They have a part to play, international institutions have a part to play. But I'm a Pan-Africanist, and I believe that at the end of the day, Africa's problems require African solutions. And we are entitled to look to leadership and partnership with the African Union, with the relevant regional entities, in order to underpin the changes that need to happen on the ground, and in order to bring pressure to bear on the government of the Cameroon, in order to provide a safe space for all the conflicted parties to come together, in order that we develop an African response to what is an African humanitarian disaster that has, yes, its origins in the colonial past, but which requires that the world today step up to the mark in order to bring about change on the ground. And that's not just going to happen because we would like it to happen. It requires activism of the sort that is represented on this particular conference call. It requires that we make our voice heard. It requires that we strategize and get together in support of the peace process and in support of conflict resolution on the ground. And that does require activism on our part. You know, it was Frederick Douglass, a great, he was a son of a slave, and he was himself a slave in the latter part of the 19th century, a great freedom fighter against slavery and against racial injustice. And Frederick Douglass said this, he said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will." We have to make that demand of the government of the Cameroon. We have to make that demand of all of the interested parties, that they get together and they put peacemaking and conflict resolution and a way forward acceptable to all the peoples of that country. That's our responsibility, and we have to make that demand. And I, again, thank those responsible for this conference, and I'm happy to join with you all in making that demand and hopefully ending this appalling ongoing injustice and suffering in that beautiful and great country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we have a few questions for you that have come in. The first one being, it's a bit of an open question, but what do you think exactly the House of Lords or the British government could actively do in order to facilitate kind of more peaceful interactions between the Cameroonian government and those? Sorry.
I think we have to step up our efforts. And what does that mean? means not just simply backing and funding, and that's very important, and I don't in any way diminish the responsibility that we have to help fund the World Food Programme, to help fund a humanitarian and developmental response. We've got a responsibility to do that. But also we have to work with other permanent members of the Security Council. We have to work through our permanent representation at the Africa Union to help this process, to facilitate the work of the churches and the voluntary sector in the Cameroon itself, the religious leadership in the Cameroon itself, to bring people together. And we have to make it absolutely clear to President Biya and to his government that this is one of our priorities as a nation in terms of our relationships in the region, and also, and importantly, within the Commonwealth, of which the Cameroon is a member. And the UK Foreign Secretary and our Parliament needs to work on the basis outlined in the Senate resolution in order to make it clear, as the new administration in Washington has made it clear, is that there are consequences. There are consequences if people are not prepared to come round the table, and if the president is not prepared to take seriously steps for peace and for the rights of the people in the affected region. The human rights to be free of torture and persecution and oppression, but also their political rights going forward, because there has to be a political solution that is acceptable to all the parties, and that requires a great deal of heavy lifting and work, as peace building always does, and as I've seen for myself when I was a diplomat and before when I was a cabinet minister. I've seen for myself in terms of the Great Lakes, in terms of the two Sudans, in terms of Somalia and Somaliland. These are challenging situations. They are not easy, and it requires a lot of heavy lifting. But if you don't make it a priority, it won't happen. And just tweeting and wringing our hands, that's not good enough.
Great, thank you very much. Just because I'm wary of time, we'll leave the rest of the questions till the end of the conference, but thank you. We'll move on to Honourable Dr. Christoph Hoffmann, if he would unmute. I've asked to unmute, so if you just, yeah, great, thank you.
Now it works. So just I want to say hello to everyone and thank the organizers for this Oxford conference. I think it's a great opportunity for the exchange and getting to the point, like Lord Boateng just mentioned. We have to get ourselves into action and get the national parliaments working and putting some awareness to the case of Southern Cameroon. The question, I think, is in Europe, what is the role of former colonial powers? How strong is their influence? And I think there is still strong ties, especially with France and Cameroon. There's lesser ties with Great Britain, but in general, Europe has a lot of ties with Cameroon. In Germany, we have not a very long period of colonialism in Cameroon. That was about 35 years and about 100 years ago. And but people still remember, and there's still some buildings you can see, even railroad bridges which still work are there. So people still remember. And I think Germany could have a nice role because they are not seen as a colonial power at these days. So they're seen more than a neutral humanitarian power in the world. So we could be a mediator. And what we tried with our parliamentarian initiatives 2 years ago was to bring the Chancellor, Ms. Merkel, to Cameroon to offer the services of mediation, but she rejected. And we did the same thing with the German foreign minister, Heiko Maas. And I just recently talked to one of his secretaries, and he said, it's not our first priority to go there. And because they still think that the Swiss mediation process could come to a positive outcome. But the Swiss mediation process is going for, I think, about 2 years already. And I'm not convinced that there is going to be an outcome because there is a blockade from the Cameroonian Bihar side. So this doesn't seem to be very successful at this point. What can we do as former colonial powers, or what can Germany do? I think public awareness is one of the points. We're trying to do that for 2 years right now. So this doesn't help anymore, I think. But we should put more emphasis on the African Union and at the ECOWAS, at the churches, and I think at the UN. And like Podeng said, like Germany was in the UN Security Council for 2 years, and we tried to make the case there. But the UN still says this is not a conflict between countries. It's a conflict within a country. So the UN security cannot act because it's not in between countries. So they still see it like an inner conflict, but it's a violation of humanitarian rights. So this could be the role of the UN to make clear that the violations of human rights will be prosecuted and will be looked up. So the resolution 684 from the US is a first step towards more international action. And we're just making a new initiative in the German parliament, reflecting on the US resolution and asking whether the German government sees some need for more action while this new US resolution is in the world. And also the Europeans have come up with a new kind of law. So the foreign commissioner, Josep Borrell, he could initiate a Magnitsky Act for Cameroon as well. So he could freeze the assets of the political leaders, of those who are responsible for murder and human rights violations and so forth. So there is new instruments and they could do, but they're not willing to do. And there's one reason, of course, this is the role of France. This is an important role. So Germany will not act if France is not aside with them. But this is a difficult question for the Germans to answer because France is our best friend within the European Union. But I think it's good to give the best friend your best advice. And the best advice is that we have to act in this case because we are not going to lose only a lot of lives in Southern Cameroon. We'll lose our reputation of being the advocacy for the rule of law, for humanitarian rights, and for democracy, not only in Cameroon, but also in other parts of Francophone Africa. We should win the hearts of the young Africans by putting more initiative into that conflict. And at the end, we cannot wait. And I have the impression that the governments of Germany, France, and maybe Great Britain as well, I cannot really judge that, are still waiting for a biological solution in the Cameroon conflict because the president is rather old. But I think this is not a solution because you never can tell when this is going to happen.
Great, thank you very much. We have quite a few questions for you, but we'll go and ask you that at the end. And we'll go now to Dr. Roxana Willis, who I think now can share her screen. So if she, great.
I think you need to ask her to unmute.
I have.
Am I mute?
No, yes, great. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Perfect. Wow, you know, when I was working in Cameroon, I learned to stop relying on technology, and it was a really wonderful thing. And I've been back in the UK for 10 years, and I've become so dependent on my PowerPoint and being able to be heard when I speak. Thank you for your patience, and I'm really pleased to be here to talk today. And it's quite an honour to follow the speakers who have so far gone ahead of me. So I was asked to outline the root causes of the crisis, which US Senate Resolution 684 urges the Cameroon government to address. And I have a very short time period to do this, but hopefully we'll cover enough. So a striking feature of the Cameroon conflict is the lack of attention afforded by international actors. Despite the brutality of violence in which children have been prime targets, international response has been worryingly minimal. US Senate Resolution 684 marks an important turning point. Hopefully, other key actors will follow suit. So a visible starting point of the conflict was the violent suppression of Anglophone protests by the majority Francophone state. For context, professional jobs are hard to access in Cameroon, and many suggest that they are denied opportunities because of their Anglophone background. This situation worsened when Francophone professionals were appointed jobs in Anglophone regions. Reports emerged of judges unable to speak English ruling on the common law, and teachers without knowledge of Anglophone curriculums appointed in Anglophone schools. Marginalisation of Anglophone heritage, cultural activities and ways of life led lawyers, teachers and civilians to protest. Despite carrying peace branches, the Cameroon state responded with disproportionate force. Hundreds of Anglophone civilians were injured, killed, and unlawfully arrested. In response to unexpected violence, some Anglophone groups tried to defend the local population. Initially, this began by constructing makeshift weapons. As the state violence escalated, Anglophone resistance grew. A minority of civilians picked up arms and joined the violent struggle. Many fighters rely on old hunting rifles, and even in December, a young man killed by state forces was equipped with very old weapons. The military power of the armed Anglophone groups is notably lacking compared to the military power of the Cameroon state, which is heavily backed by international actors. Over the last 10 years, the US has channeled hundreds of millions of dollars into state military forces. Germany pays the largest sum of development funding in the world to Cameroon, which was 100 million euros between 2017 and 2019 alone. Germany has also conducted a 4-year covert military operation in Cameroon to train the army in anti-terrorism techniques. Since 2018, the UK government has supported the London-based firm New Age to win a contract to develop an offshore gas project in Cameroon, which is estimated to be worth more than $250 million. This lucrative contract sees money going directly to the state-owned company, SNH, which reportedly funds the elite armed forces of the Cameroon state. France's involvement in Cameroon has continued since independence and is by far the most significant. In addition to military support and trade deals, France has maintained indirect control of the local currency and has been heavily involved in the political process. International involvement and economic dependency on the peoples of Cameroon is long running. These exploitative relationships began in the 17th century, when millions of African people were forcibly relocated during the repugnant transatlantic slave trade. This has formed the basis of relationships in modern-day Cameroon. An important body of scholarship shows how the exploitative socio-economic structure implemented through the European legal regime of slavery continues to structure exploitative relationships in the present, albeit in transmuted forms. Slavery informally continued in Cameroon during the colonial rule of Germany, France, and Britain. During the second phase of colonialism, the French and British forces haphazardly divided Cameroon, with France taking the larger share. France and Britain then each implemented a range of cultural institutions which fuel the conflict we see today. Resistance against European exploitation has been a long-running feature of West African and Cameroonian history. From uprisings against slave traders on ships to rebellions in the fields and full-scale revolution. There are notable figures in the Anglophone struggle against oppression, two of which I mention here. For many years, Ndane Namtamza attempted to make the international community open its eyes to the plight of Anglophone Cameroonians. And the human rights activist Albert Monkong dedicated his life to challenging the marginalization and mistreatment of Southern Cameroonians. In addition to petitioning local and international communities, Anglophone Cameroonians have also exhausted legal avenues in the struggle. This includes pursuing numerous human rights cases at the level of the United Nations, which has resulted in the creation of a rich body of jurisprudence that documents sustained and extreme state violence against the Anglophone peoples. Moreover, regional jurisprudence has also been developed by Anglophone activists. The 2009 judgment by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights anticipates the current conflict. Here, the Commission urges for dialogue, calls on the state to end discriminatory treatment against the Anglophone minority, and appeals for legal proceedings to take place in Anglophone regions and in a language understood by the accused, among other recommendations. To conclude, the root causes of the Cameroon conflict are multi-layered and complex. Relationships between Anglophone civilians and the Cameroon state and international state actors have largely been exploitative and infused with power imbalance. Unfortunately, these relationships continue into the present. Despite gross inequalities and centuries of being ignored, the Anglophone peoples of Cameroon continue to resist and strive for a long overdue freedom. In 2021, the discussion we should be having is about reparations and apologies for centuries of wrongdoing. Instead, we're witnessing wealthy nations willingly ignore mass atrocities in order to bite more of the pie. This is adding to a growing moral debt that we will one day need to repay.
Great, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Hannah Gary. So I'll just ask her to unmute. Hello.
Hi, can you all hear me well?
Yes, well, I can.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So good morning from California. Good afternoon, good evening to all of you from wherever you're dialing in from. It really is an honor to take part in this first panel discussion on US Senate Resolution 684, and which, as you know, addresses the conflict in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon. I want to start out just by thanking Dr. Roxana Willis at the University of Oxford, Faculty of Law, and Mr. Effie Tambone, Chair of the Cameroon Working Group, for the honor of the invitation to join this distinguished panel. I'd also like to thank you, Rania, and the Oxford Student Society on the Cameroon conflict for all of your efforts in organizing this critical conference. So I am Clinical Professor of Law, founding director of the International Human Rights Clinic at the University of Southern California School of Law. And in the clinic, we engage student attorneys at the graduate level in legal representation and advocacy for upholding fundamental human rights for all. We've done work before the International Criminal Court, the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and have made global Magnitsky Act submissions seeking accountability for atrocity crimes, namely war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. In addition, I teach and research in the areas of international criminal law, refugee law, as well as transitional justice, and have been a legal officer at the Yugoslav and Rwandan tribunals, and recently have done work before the International Criminal Court as a Amici counsel in the Afghanistan situation. also serving as senior legal advisor to the Cambodia Tribunal. Now, relevant for this panel discussion, since the end of 2017, the International Human Rights Clinic has been calling attention to the unfolding crisis in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon by making detailed factual and legal submissions documenting serious violations of international human rights law to various officials in the United Nations, the African Union, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the IMF, and UNESCO. In addition, the clinic has been briefing US congressional members as well as US Departments of State and Treasury on the crisis. Currently, the clinic is preparing a detailed factual and legal report documenting the ongoing grave abuses against civilian Anglophones, including through in-depth interviews with dozens of refugees, with a view towards assisting any future investigations of perpetrators. So how do we in the clinic see the current situation in Cameroon? In the Northwest and Southwest regions, it's nothing short of an atrocity situation, consisting of discriminatory, widespread, and systematic crimes against humanity, against the civilian population, and serious violations of international humanitarian law against civilians as protected persons, amounting to war crimes. Some non-governmental organizations are now alerting to early warning signs of a potential genocide. And as noted in US Senate Resolution 684, the current armed crisis began in late 2016 when security forces cracked down with violent use of force against widespread peaceful protests organized by Anglophone lawyers, teachers, and students against discriminatory policies in the legal systems and schools. At the same time, curfews were imposed, public gatherings were banned, and internet access was shut off in the entirety of the Anglophone regions for over 3 months in early 2017. And since then, in addition to multiple government-imposed internet and social media shutdowns, in an effort to suppress coverage of the unfolding crisis, radio stations have been suspended, journalists' visas revoked, and some have been labeled terrorists. Meanwhile, journalists have called for an end to circulation of hate speech on national TV news against Anglophones. Now, after 4 years of escalating civil unrest between government forces and non-state armed groups, Cameroon faces a humanitarian catastrophe exacerbated by the current COVID pandemic. Over 200 villages have been burnt to the ground. There have been widespread killings, currently estimated around 5,000 to 6,000, but as Dr. Willis noted, there is no official number that's confirmed. Forced disappearances, arbitrary detention, torture, rape, and other acts of sexual violence, and more than 700,000 civilians forcibly displaced from their homes, with over 60,000 refugees across the border in Nigeria and tens of thousands elsewhere. It is estimated that over 80% of children in the Anglophone regions, over 1.1 million, have been unable to attend school since 2017. For the past 2 years, Cameroon has topped the list of the most neglected crises published by the Norwegian Refugee Council, with around 3 million in need of humanitarian assistance, while access to such assistance has been blocked by the parties to the conflict. So what must be done? With the issuance of US Senate Resolution 684 at the beginning of this year, I would like to highlight aspects from the resolution in particular that we in the clinic consider crucial for addressing and resolving the ongoing Anglophone crisis in Cameroon. First, as noted in the preamble to the resolution, the violence must be stopped. For too long, over 4 years now, the international community has stood by or taken insufficient action while an atrocity situation has unfolded before our eyes. Enough is enough. It is imperative that we do so to prevent an escalation potentially to genocide. Second, as noted in the very last paragraph of the resolution, members of the international community must, quote, use regional and international fora, including the African Union and the United Nations Security Council, to maintain calls for the investigation and prosecution of human rights abuses and crimes committed against civilians, unquote. Simply put, there must be accountability for long-lasting peace. We in the clinic submit that Western governments such as the UK, EU member states, particularly France and Germany, the US and Canada work together with willing African Union states to address the situation in Cameroon as follows. First, issue a strong resolution, such as US Senate Resolution 684, condemning the ongoing serious human rights abuses and calling for targeted global Magnitsky sanctions against perpetrators on both sides of the conflict to signal that the international community is watching. Second, implement targeted Magnitsky sanctions, such as freezing assets and imposing visa restrictions in coordination with other governments in order to encourage the leaders of the parties to the conflict to reach a ceasefire and engage in discussions towards a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Third, consider acting as a neutral third-party mediator to facilitate a truly inclusive dialogue between the parties to address the root causes of the conflict. Fourth, support efforts towards establishing a fact-finding commission of inquiry through the UN or the AU to investigate the atrocities for a full accounting of what's going on the ground. In our research in the clinic, we have found underreporting on gender-based violence and the impact of the conflict on women and children in particular. And fifth, work to end impunity for atrocity crimes that have been perpetrated thus far through judicial proceedings, whether it be through support for a case against Cameroon before the International Court of Justice or investigation of perpetrators by national, regional, or international criminal jurisdictions, such as the International Criminal Court or an ad hoc hybrid court. Finally, we urge all states who are security partners with Cameroon or providers of aid to the country to join forces in re-examining their relationship with a view towards pressuring the government to end the violence and engage in mediated, inclusive dialogue with Anglophone groups. By way of example, here in the United States, my government has taken the following actions. In February 2019, withheld security assistance, including equipment and training under the Leahy laws, citing credible allegations of human rights violations by state security forces against the Anglophone population and diversion of US security assistance from counterterrorism efforts in the region. In December 2019, the US terminated Cameroon's designation as a trade beneficiary under the African Growth and Opportunity Act in light of gross violations of human rights. And here recently in 2020, added Cameroon to the US State Department's Child Soldiers Prevention Act list, a designation which prohibits security assistance to Cameroon under the International Military Education and Training, Foreign Military Financing and Excess Defense Articles, and also prohibits the issuance of licenses for direct commercial sales of military equipment to Cameroon. In closing, working for both peace and justice in Cameroon is critical, not only because of the numerous civilian victims of atrocity crimes, but also for promoting regional stability and preventing an escalation of such senseless suffering in future. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Gary. Our next speaker is Dr. Chris Fominio from the National Democratic Institute. So if you would unmute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderator, for this opportunity. I really want to join my co-panelists in thanking the organizers of this Oxford University conference and giving us a platform to put forward ideas that could help bring an end to this senseless war. I want to associate myself with the statements of my co-panelists and thank them for really stepping up and setting the stage for what I expect to be a very meaningful and fruitful discussion. Professor Willis for her overview, which is very poignant and precise. Lord Boateng for his global appeal that elected officials, members of parliaments across the world should be seized with this issue, the way that the US Senate has been seized to enact legislation and resolution 684. And Honorable Hofmann for stepping forward and beginning to initiate some actions within the German parliament that can influence events within not just Germany, but also the European Union. And of course, Professor Gary for her leadership in trying to instill accountability and an end to the impunity that we now see in the conflict in Cameroon. I was asked to specifically address the role of the international community, and notably including the United States, with regards to the implementation of Resolution 684. So I wouldn't belabor the points that have already been made by previous speakers, and I'll go directly to the assignment that I was given. I would, however, preface my remarks with 2 points for the record. First is that the Norwegian Refugee Council that Professor Gary referred to for 2 years in a row has stated that the conflict that's currently taking place in former British Southern Cameroons is the most underreported conflict in the world for 2 years in a row. The Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugees Council, Jan Egeland, is one of the highest profile of personalities that had the courage to go visit the conflict zones. Many people have sat in their comfort zones in New York and Washington or in other capitals and have issued statements without taking the effort, without making the effort to go see for themselves the lives that are being lost and the destruction, the level of destruction that's being emitted on the people of former British Cameroon, or what's commonly referred to in Cameroon today as the Northwest and Southwest regions of the country. The second point I want to bring to our attention is that the United States Holocaust Museum, highly reputable organization, has now classified Cameroon as one of the priority countries in its conflict prevention center, in its genocide prevention center, which is something that's a wake-up call to all of us, that an institution that specializes in tracking genocide and atrocities around the world is now so preoccupied with what is happening in Cameroon to be able to shortlist it as a country of concern and priority. So with those 2 ideas, let me get straight to the United Nations, and I have 3 points to make with regards to the United Nations. The United Nations needs to step up and speak out. First of all, we are aware of the fact that the United Nations Security Council last year adopted Resolution 2532, which was a resolution that called for a global ceasefire because of COVID-19, and basically encapsulated or captured a statement issued by the UN Secretary General himself. There is no doubt in anyone's mind that that resolution 2532 was not respected in Cameroon, because some of the worst atrocities that we saw through 2020 happened right in the thick of the COVID-19 pandemic. As Africa, as the world really braces to a second wave of COVID-19, which is certainly going to hit Africa and Cameroon in particular, we have to be sensitized to the fact that that resolution was not implemented. And if we do not have an immediate ceasefire, that the impact of these atrocities or this conflict are going to be aggravated by the second wave of COVID-19. Secondly, I'll ask that the United Nations facilitate and contribute to putting in place a delegation that can conduct a fact-finding mission. And the United Nations Human Rights Council may be the vehicle most appropriate for this. They have the necessity being driven by the fact that we do not have the data that we need or updated information on this crisis because of the blackout on the international media, the impossibility that international human rights organizations have to be able to access the country, let alone the conflict zones, confirms the fact that the conflict is being underreported. Everyone on this call will remember that since 2019, the official figures of deaths in this conflict have stayed miraculously at 3,000 deaths. Whereas we know that people are being killed on a daily basis, and that even since January 1, 2021, more than 60 people have already been killed as a result of this crisis. Yet on every official report that you see, there's reference to 3,000 deaths. So whether it's 1.1 million kids out of school, whether it's close to 1 million people that are internally displaced persons, or 70,000 that are refugees in Nigeria and other neighboring countries, the data on this crisis is underreported. And the one thing that can give everybody around the globe viable information to work with, it's a high-level fact-finding mission that will report its findings to the United Nations Security Council that can then be pushed to make resolutions, to adopt resolutions to make sure that this conflict can be brought to an end and that the atrocities and gross violations of human rights could also be brought to an end. Thirdly, United Nations agencies have to raise their voices. There are horrible things happening that fall within the jurisdiction of various United Nations agencies, and yet we're not seeing the sense of urgency that ought to be applied to this case. UNICEF, for example, when we talk about 1.1 million kids out of school, when we know that for 5 years, the kids that were 12, 13 years old are now becoming adults without a level of education that's going to help them in the future, then we know that we are condemning the next generation or multiple generations of English-speaking Cameroonians. The UNICEF ought to be shouting out on rooftops with regards to the plight of children caught up in this conflict and children of the former British Southern Cameroons. UN Women, we're hearing about prostitution, young girls being exposed to prostitution and violence against women in the other regions in which they now live as internally displaced persons, detached and abandoned from their families, that they can't find and reunite. UN Women should be out there bringing people to highlighting the plight of women and children and young girls as a result of this conflict. WHO, we've heard about the burning of health facilities. A hospital was destroyed in Kumba, was burned down in Kumba last year or the year before. We've heard about armed groups or soldiers in uniform going into health facilities, allegedly looking for members of armed groups. This is unacceptable. This is a breach of international law, humanitarian law, and these are incidents that should be highlighted by UN agencies in order to bring more credibility to the reporting that we're seeing on the ground. Let me, in the remainder of my time, talk about the US administration. And as you all know, I do not work for the US government, so I cannot speak for the US government, but as someone based in Washington that observes how US policies are made and how US politics plays itself out, I would venture to make the following suggestions. One, with regards to the Biden administration, I think it started off in the right place. President Joe Biden made one of his first calls to the African Union to say the United States, it's back. The United States recognizes the role of the African Union, and the United States wants to work with the African Union and other regional organizations to make sure that the human rights of citizens are respected everywhere in the world. I'm paraphrasing, but it's almost a quote with regards to human rights and the violations that we now see in a country like Cameroon. I also would highlight the fact that the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, in his confirmation hearings, made specific reference to the conflict in Cameroon as one of the priority areas of concern for him as Secretary of State. And we hope that now that he's been confirmed, as he puts in place his team on Africa and on Cameroon, that he will be able to make sure that this conflict stays a priority for the State Department. I also would want to look around and see the people who are being brought into the Biden administration, many of whom are very conversant of the root causes of this crisis and the plight of people in the Northwest and the Southwest, and whom in their respective positions should do everything in their power to make sure that the crisis can be front and center and that we can galvanize the international support that's required to bring an end to this hostility. I'm thinking about the US ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who is an Africanist, former Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, and very knowledgeable about the crisis, and recognizing the fact that a lot of things get resolved within the United Nations system. And if you have someone there who is conversant of the crisis, they should take on that responsibility to make sure that everyone else is well informed and that the international community can play a role in bringing an end to this crisis. Joe Biden himself has a unique relationship with the US Congress because he was a senator prior to becoming the vice president for Barack Obama, and while in the Senate was a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So he knows Africa well, he knows how to build alliances, and our hope is that he's going to be able to build these alliances to make sure that he can put his money where his mouth has been for the past 3 weeks. That then takes me to the second level of influence within Washington circles, which is the United States Congress. We are very fortunate to see that for the first time in American history, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee is an African-American Congressman, Gregory Meeks, who knows Africa and who is as seized with the challenges that the continent faces as many of us on this call are. Our hope is that the chairman is going to use his position of influence to make sure that the executive branch can get the resources that they need to be able to implement policies that will bring an end to this conflict, but also in the process of checks and balances to be able to hold the executive branch to deliver on the promise to contribute to meaningful peace in Cameroon. And the last point that I would say is that Congressman Meeks, working with the chair of the Africa Subcommittee in the person of Representative Karen Bass and many other well-wishers, should be able to make sure the Congress continues to be seized with this issue. Of course, I couldn't end without talking about the US Senate and Resolution 684, because it was remarkable that despite the polarization that we now see in US politics, that the US Senate was able to come together in a bipartisan fashion to adopt this resolution on January 1, 2021. That we see promise within the US Senate that they're not going to stop at this, that they're going to engage their bilateral partners, legislators in other countries. They're going to think through transforming the resolution into a bill and into a legislation that will have benchmarks and carrots and sticks to make sure that something could be done to bring an end to this senseless conflict. So in a nutshell, and to finish, I believe that the moment is right, that the context is appropriate for all of us to redouble our efforts in advocacy, to build the kind of consensus that we need across the globe to help the people on the ground who for the past 5 years have had to live through killings, atrocities, death, and destruction, and who wish that their voices be heard, that the root causes of this conflict be addressed, and that they be able to live in peace. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to addressing any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Angela Quintal from the Committee to Protect Journalists. So I've now lost it.
Good day. Thank you for the opportunity and greetings to all. I've been asked to paint a picture of what it's like to be a journalist in Cameroon. Well, if you were Samuel Wazizi, you'd have been arrested. Your last words to a colleague who saw you in police custody before you were handed over to the military would have been, "Don't let me die in here." And indeed, you did die. And that was a few days later. Except your family, colleagues, friends, lawyers, and press freedom advocates like CPJ continue to advocate for your release. We were none the wiser. In good faith, we turned to the courts and the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention to secure Wazizi's release, until the military disclosed 10 months after his arrest that he had died in custody while detained incommunicado. And we repeat our call that there should be no impunity when it comes to the deaths of journalists and others in Cameroon. Now, if you, Mimi Mefo and Ahmed Abba, who were arrested and jailed for their journalism on charges of false news and terrorism, respectively, You'll now be working in exile, leaving your loved ones behind in Cameroon. And like Mimi, you'll be subjected to threats, smears, as well as online harassment and abuse. If you Wawa Jackson 4, you'll have spent almost 3 years in detention, falsely accused of publishing secessionist information. You will have been denied bail. You would have faced countless court delays, adjournments, and a myriad of other due process violations. Judgment was supposed to have been yesterday. It has again been postponed, and now we expect it on Friday. If you're English-speaking journalists like C. Conrad, Mancha Bibixi, or Thomas Awa, you'll be among the journalists serving long-term sentences, convicted under the country's terrorism law. And you will have been convicted by a military court, even though you're a civilian. You'll be locked up in the overcrowded Kondengui Central Prison in Yaoundé during a pandemic. And even if you're not a journalist covering the news in Cameroon's English-speaking regions, you still run the risk of arbitrary arrests elsewhere. So you could ask the journalist Tamai Jarvis and at least 8 other journalists who were detained last year while covering anti-Bia protests in Douala and Yaoundé. Or you could be Paul Chota, arrested in May 2019, in detention in Kondengui Principal Prison, accused of false news and still waiting for his trial to be finalized. Now, obviously, this has a chilling effect on the media community. While Cameroonian citizens are denied their right for information or their right to information to make informed decisions. And clearly, the international community is also denied that right to critical information. And I don't have the time, but the Garbo massacre is a perfect example of where journalists should have been on the ground and not Human Rights Watch or others, or Human Rights Watch, sure, should have been there, but why did we not see international journalists? Why did we not see local journalists other than Equinox TV and online outlets with publishers overseas like Mememefo Info or the Cameroonian News Agency covering this massacre and asking the right questions? Now, yes, since late 2016, when lawyers, teachers, and students took the streets to protest against their marginalization in the Anglophone regions, CPJ has documented more than 24 cases of journalists arrested and accused of terrorism, false news, criminal defamation, or supporting secessionists. And this is why Cameroon is the 3rd worst jailer of journalists in Africa for 3 years in a row, after Egypt and Eritrea. And that's according to CPJ's annual prison census of imprisoned journalists worldwide. It's not a coincidence that these arrests coincide with the increased conflict in the Anglophone regions, and of course, because of government repression. So there are at least 8 journalists currently in jail in Cameroon for their work, the most since we started keeping records. We're also investigating the case of a 9th journalist to see whether that journalist has been jailed in connection to journalism. Apparently, he's facing false news charges. So journalists in Cameroon are facing direct censorship, but they also resort to self-censorship. Current affairs programs have been pulled off air, newspapers and radio stations suspended or shuttered. Time and again, I've spoken to journalists who have told me it's better to simply cover soft news and to avoid politics or the Boko Haram insurgency in the far north province, just to avoid government retaliation. So as attitudes hardened in the Northwest, it's not only the authoritarian government of President Biya that journalists have to worry about. Journalists have also been threatened and intimidated by separatists. Some journalists were abducted and ransomed. Mary Namondo, who was kidnapped at a radio station, Mary witnessed the insurgents setting the station alight. Terrified, she was blindfolded and taken to an unknown location and only released 2 days later after public outcry and behind the scenes efforts to release her, including from my organization, CPJ. And then we look at the arsenal of laws that are used against journalists. In 2017, I wrote a special report on Cameroon titled Journalists Not Terrorists, on the use of the anti-terror law that continues to be used to silence journalists and to suppress dissent. We have also documented an increase in the use of false news, charges against journalists. Egypt tops the list worldwide, followed by Cameroon, according to our research. And yet the government insists that there is press freedom and points to the fact that there are hundreds of newspapers, scores of radio stations and television stations, as well as news websites. But as I've tried to describe, this does not mean that the information flows freely in Cameroon. And in the end, it is the Cameroonian public who are shortchanged. So does Senate Resolution 684 meet our concerns? Well, CPJ contributed to the drafting of the clauses dealing with journalists, and we wholeheartedly endorse the call for all jailed journalists to be released immediately. And we renew our call for an independent inquiry into Samuel Wazizi's death in custody. But obviously, Resolution 684 is not enough. You have heard what other panelists have had to say. So let me suggest some short-term practical interventions for Cameroonian journalists that will not require much effort from foreign governments and legislators when it comes to journalists. And so it includes diplomats attending trials of journalists and political prisoners, visiting them in jail, maintaining active contact with marginalized or at-risk journalists. We need the public and private condemnation of restrictions on the media. Foreign governments, including those on our continent, should embrace an emergency visa regime for journalists under threat, including those from Cameroon. We need more fellowships and scholarships for journalists in distress. We need financial support and training for independent media. We need an overhaul of Cameroon's anti-terror law, the cybercrime law, and other laws that are inimical to the freedom of expression and the public's right to access to information. And we need an end to criminal defamation and internet and social media shutdowns. These, of course, should not be a mere afterthought or a good to have, but needs to be part of any negotiated settlement. We know a free media is essential for democracy. And just finally, on a personal note, as a South African, I saw what role the international community could play in ensuring democracy and peace in my own country. And my question is a simple one. Why are we not seeing similar attention to Cameroon? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the speakers who spoke today. Because I'm wary of the time, I'll just be asking just a few of the many, many questions that have come in, all of which were really great. The first question is to Lord Bertang. It's about your role as the co-chair of the APPG on Cameroon. People were wondering what kind of your role and time on the APPG helped reveal about the crisis and whether there might be another one, and what your role as co-chair of the APPG entailed. I'll just go. Okay. I've asked to unmute.
Right. I wasn't actually a co-chair of the APPG. I was a Lords member and an officer of the APPG. And I think it taught me a couple of things. One of them was confirm my belief in the importance of parliamentary activity. And I'm glad to say that continues with a group now called the Friends of the Cameroon. It's an informal grouping brought together and to support the work of the World Food Programme in the Cameroon, who are doing great work there and who deserve support, feeding the hungry. So parliamentary activity important. I think the APPG was a experience that revealed very starkly, I have to say, the internal differences within the expatriate Cameroonian community in the UK. I won't say more than that, but they came very much to the fore in the course of the APPG's work. Since the APPG came into existence in the last parliament, there has not been an attempt to revive it in the current parliament, because each APPG dies with the parliament in which it was established. And I don't see an APPG on the Cameroon specifically being established anytime soon. I do see, however, the importance of parliamentary activity, and the parliamentary group Friends of the Cameroon is working very effectively in that area and is reaching out to other European and global parliamentarians as a focus of parliamentary activity, and continues to seek to engage in dialogue to get the Commonwealth Secretariat, because after all, Cameroon is a member of the Commonwealth, to get the Commonwealth Secretariat to take a higher profile on these issues than, frankly, currently it has done. We are told that the Commonwealth Secretary General has made representations to President Biya, but it's very clear that President Biya has not paid those representations any mind, because it doesn't seem to have changed the situation on the ground one jot.
Thank you very much. We have one more question for you. So, sorry, I've just lost my place for a second. Yes. What do you think the next step for the UK government is or how much of a role the UK government plans to take on following the US Senate resolution?
I think the next step of the UK government, and indeed I've put down a parliamentary question that sought to encourage this, is to reach out to the new administration, President Biden's administration, to see what we can do jointly with the United States in this area, to reach out also to the French government, to see what we can do as the two former preeminent colonial powers. I think we have a specific responsibility to act in this way, and I thought we had a very good suggestion from Angela, to make sure, and I think there are signs that the UK High Commissioner is active on the ground, but to make sure that the High Commissioner in the Cameroon is sufficiently staffed and resourced to attend trials, is sufficiently staffed and resourced to visit the affected regions. I mean, I regard it as part of my job as a member, as a newly appointed member of the International Relations and Defence Committee of the House of Lords, is to argue the case for the implementation of our report on sub-Saharan Africa, for the United Kingdom to up its profile on the Cameroon, to give yet more resources to our effective High Commissioner in the Cameroon, in order that the High Commission can be represented on the ground as effectively as possible. And I think Angela's point is a very, very important one. And I certainly intend to ask a question specifically about journalists and about attendance at trials, because I think it's a very important point.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Dr. Hoffman. The question is, how do you think colonial countries can assist in the Cameroonian conflict, especially keeping in mind the lack of recognition that colonial history has been receiving so far, especially with regards to Cameroon?
I did not understand clearly the question. I'm sorry, I just got some words and not the whole sense of the question. Could you please repeat?
Yes, sorry. The question was, how do you think colonial countries could assist in the Cameroon conflict, especially keeping in mind the lack of recognition that it has been given so far in history?
Well, I tried to answer this question already, saying so that the powers like France could play their role, as we have seen in the charts, in the history charts, and that France is one of the most important countries for Cameroon, economic-wise, but also military-wise. So France has a key role in this conflict, and as I said, Germany could give his friend France some good advice, saying that we cannot go on like this. And but this is a remark regarding all Francophone countries in Africa. We cannot go on like this. I mean, this is a young new generation in Africa. We cannot support old leaders who have pushed themselves into power, either by military or either by ignoring the constitution. I mean, this has come to an end. Otherwise, we won't get friends with a new generation in Africa. So this is a general remark. And regarding the Cameroon conflict, I think we should go forward and demand at France to ask Biya who he would accept as a mediator. I mean, like the Swiss mediation process I mentioned doesn't come forward because it's blocked by Biya administration. And but now we have to turn the question around and say, who would be acceptable for him in the first place to get forward in this kind of mediation? Otherwise, he can block everything, and I don't see how he can share his power with someone else. I don't see that point. And like we had some other panelists saying that there has to be some international involvement, but how? You want UN troops there, you want African Union troops there, and who's gonna go to pay for it? I mean, this is really harsh questions. And so I think the mediation process should be the first thing to try and to do, because every other thing will be more complicated, more difficult to put in place.
Thank you very much. The next question is to Professor Gary. So the question says that there is evidence that a United Nations international mandated fact-finding mission might help in reducing violence and set a peace roadmap, or at least help in contributing to it. What do you think is the process to getting this started, in your opinion? Sorry, please.
Thank you very much for that question. I would like to agree with Dr. Hoffman in the statements that were just made with regard to the importance for a ceasefire in the first place in mediation and providing for some stability on the ground. But as part of that process, Dr. Fumunyo had mentioned perhaps trying to set up a fact-finding mission of inquiry through the Human Rights Council or the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Office. I agree that that might be a good approach. Also, countries sitting, permanent 5 countries, former colonial powers sitting on the UN Security Council should also, in my view, move forward with regard to considering perhaps establishing such a commission of inquiry. It was mentioned before that the UN Security Council has not acted in the past because they see this as purely an internal conflict. However, in many situations, including the former Yugoslavia, the UN Security Council has seen and pronounced it to be a threat to international peace and security, even if it is an internal conflict. And similar to the Balkans and other parts of the world where the UN Security Council has observed as much. You have refugee flows across the border into neighboring countries, particularly Nigeria, and it is leading to great regional instability, the crisis. And so it should be high on the agenda of the UN Security Council as well.
Thank you very much. The next question is to Dr. Fomonyo, which is, do you think that if the international community is going to be addressing the armed conflict, they should also be creating a platform for the leaders of former British Southern Cameroonians to address their grievances to the international community? I guess just Southern Cameroonians in general. Just us to meet.
Obviously, that's the benefit of a negotiated process, and that's why we're all appealing that there should be an immediate ceasefire and a commitment to a negotiated way out, because negotiations would bring all of the parties to the table. We've seen that work. We've seen that work in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo. I was part of that process with the former president of Botswana, President Ked Mesiri, that spent years bringing the Congolese together, bringing everyone, including the leaders of the armed groups, to sit around the table, sort out their differences, address the root causes, and create a roadmap for the country. That's the benefit of a negotiated process. If I could just stray and take 1 minute, with regards to what Dr. Hoffman said, and I'm so delighted that he couched it so beautifully by saying friends can give friends good advice. And if Germany is talking to France, I would say to France 2 things. 1, if the rules were reversed in Cameroon, and if this were a Francophone minority in a country with a majority of Anglophone population, in which people were being slaughtered because of their attachment to the English tradition, the English legal system, the English educational system, would France stand by and see that happen to a minority Francophone population in a majority Anglophone population country? Second point is that when people make references to Rwanda, it's real, because when UN agencies talk about 4 million people being impacted, we all know how African families are interconnected. You should extrapolate that to think of the 2 or 3 other million people who depend on the 4 million people who've initially been identified as being impacted, and come to the conclusion that every single human being in that part of the country, every single human being in the Northwest or Southwest regions, every single human being in or directly related to the former British Southern Cameroons is being impacted by this crisis. When people talk about Rwanda, they remember, and the French should remember, how their reputation is suffered since Rwanda. It's not for nothing that we saw recently in Mali that people were putting down the French flag and running through the streets with the Russian flag. It's not for nothing that we see in a country like the Central African Republic, which is next door to Cameroon, that people are embracing Russia and staying away from the French with whom they've had long-lasting relationships. These things count. And right now we have a younger generation of Africans who are growing up differently, who want to be able to express themselves. And someday they're going to look at the history of what's happening today in that part of Cameroon and will hold everybody accountable for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This question is to Dr. Willis. So the UN says that the Cameroon crisis is internal, so they're reluctant to intervene. Why then did the international community intervene in Bosnia, Iraq, and other countries? And how do you think that individual governments could well, it says force, but more like help the UN into taking a more hands-on approach, if that is what's needed to be.
Thank you for that. So I'm not an expert on the UN, and I'll take an aspect of that question where I perhaps can comment. And so why isn't the UN acting in this case? And I think the UN, it's often the humanitarian aims. And from having researched at first, it kind of seemed like we might be having a humanitarian crisis or issue. And it's through the research process I've come to realize, actually, this is a hugely economic issue. And why is action not happening? Well, it comes down to there's too much money involved, and there's too many actors involved that are benefiting from the current status quo. And it's quite hard, I think, for things to happen within that structure. So in terms of moving forwards, we really need to start having an honest conversation about these multi-million-pound trade deals that are taking place. And that needs to happen within the countries as well. So how is Britain, should we talk about this New Age deal publicly, democratically? Is it in the public interest, the British public interest, to be building up our moral debt, which is already, we have a swelling moral debt to pay to the rest of the world? Should we be adding more to this? And that should, I think, be a public issue. It should be a democratic issue. It should be brought up, discussed in the House of Lords. Is this in the best interest of the British public as well as the Cameroonian public? Because I don't think these trade deals at the moment are in the best interests of British public, of the French public, of the German public, of the United States public, and certainly not of the oppressed and abused Cameroon population, and especially the minority Anglophone population.
Thank you. Lord Berting, would you like to add something?
Yes, I don't think we should give up on the UN on the basis that this is an internal matter. Because let's not forget, these were originally mandated territories. You know, the UN intervened actively to give a mandate to France and Germany, rather the predecessor body of the UN, intervened actively to give a mandate to France and Germany during the colonial period. The UN, as a successor to the League of Nations, also took an interest in oversight of the plebiscite, which initially actually was arguably mishandled. So I don't think the UN can just wipe its hands and say that this isn't a matter in which they have any locus. I think they do have a locus and a moral responsibility. I would also just make this point too. I think we need to recognize, in terms of maintaining the peace in the region, that the Cameroon is itself a player in maintaining stability in the region. And therefore you can't allow the Cameroon to become even more unstable than it already is. Because don't forget, there are Nigerians fleeing Boko Haram going into the Cameroon. So so you can't separate what's happening in the Sahel generally from what is happening in the Cameroon in terms of a responsibility to avoid, to reduce a conflict and promote peace. So I think we need really to continue to apply the pressure. Our governments need to apply the pressure in terms of the UN machinery. And we have to, yes, to recognize, I'm afraid, that France has, over the entirety of the colonial period, turned a blind eye to some extremely distasteful regimes in the region. They did so for a long time and continue to do so, arguably, in some areas, because it suited a particular economic interest. And there's one final point I'd make. The notion that because President Biya is an old man, we can wait until he passes on to the place where all old presidents go in the end. You know, I heard that argument used in relation to Robert Mugabe. Actually, the situation in Zim now is worse than it was under Robert Mugabe in terms of freedom. So the notion that time will heal this matter because it will get rid of beer and that beer is the only obstacle to peace in that country, I don't believe that. These are deep-rooted problems that have their origins that go back many, many years and that are greater than Biya and his baleful influence alone. And it's a complex issue, but one that the UN, working with the African Union, has to embrace and take on board.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everyone, especially for all the questions you've sent in, and thank you again to all the speakers. This has been so informative and really, really important discussion. Just to end the conference for today, I'd like to hand over to Effie Tembon, who was the organizer of this whole event. Effie is here. Hi, Effie.
Hi, everyone. I want to express gratitude to the panelists for doing a fantastic job presenting the case, and for all those who attended. And on behalf of the partners, Oxford University, the International Human Rights Clinic, the University of Southern California, the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and the Cameroon Student Society at Oxford University, and on behalf of the Cameroon Working Group, 23 organizations that form part of the Cameroon Working Group of the Advocacy Network of Africa, we want to say thank you so much for coming together. After the Holocaust, the world came together and said, never again. And never again was not just going to be a slogan, never again is a commitment. And we are committed to say never again. And we will continue to liaise with our panelists and all of those who love peace, who want to see a resolution of the root causes, work together to bring this to an end and to see justice and accountability in the Southern Cameroons. So we thank you. We invite you back again on Friday for the final day of the conference, and knowing that we will work together. And thank you, speakers, again. Thank you, Rania, for doing a wonderful job moderating. And yep, you made an applause from all of us. You did a really wonderful job. And thank you again. Thank you, Caroline, for pouring out your heart at the beginning of the conference, just helping to paint the picture of what's going on. And I really appreciate all of you. We look forward to working together to make sure that we can see these atrocities come to an end. May God bless all of you.
Thank you very much.